Dr. Helen Costigane. She's well known to many of us, and she has a long history of serving the church as a religious sister and as a brilliant communicator, a lecturer, a senior lecturer at, first of all, Heathrow College, now dissolved or about, yeah. And more recently now, she's the senior lecturer at St. Mary's in Strawberry Hill. She has spoken to this group, or similar group, at St. James's a few months ago now, and I'm just looking forward very much to your presentation today on barriers and obstacles to the Eucharist. So I'm sure you will enlighten us and keep us laughing and joking and crying. So it's over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
I hope you can hear me okay? Yeah, and you can understand me because I am speaking English. Poor old England getting beaten by Belgium. Who could have foreseen that? Oh. Never mind. I'm not happy about it, by the way, you know. I'm not one of those people who support anybody but England. I've lived here too long not to be an England supporter. So today I want to look at barriers and obstacles to the Eucharist, and possibly also rays of hope. In the Adoramus booklet, I told a wee story which I'll begin with here. And don't worry, this is not going to be a monologue from me, because I want to throw out a few ideas and then have you discuss some questions that I've come up with, or maybe some questions that you yourself come up with. The story is that in the aftermath of the Second World War, many children rescued from concentration camps were traumatised by starvation and deprivation. Though finding themselves in new settings which were secure and healing, and where food was more readily available than they had previously experienced, their carers noticed the inability of these children to sleep at night. Realising that the children were anxious about whether they might still have food when they awoke the next day, the adults gave each of them a piece of bread to sleep with. This gave the children reassurance that when they awoke, they could be sure of something to eat. It also became a pledge, a symbol, that they were safe and no longer alone. On Holy Thursday, Jesus gave a similar assurance to us that he would not leave us bereft, and he gave us a tangible sign of his care and love, that we would never be hungry and that we would never be alone. He instituted the Eucharist as the memorial of his death and resurrection, and commanded his apostles to celebrate it until his return. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, he did this in order to leave them a pledge of his love, in order never to depart from his own, and to make them sharers in his Passover. However, today I want to look at what might be some barriers and obstacles, real or imagined, that there might be to receiving the Eucharist. Before I enter into the heavy stuff, last night just occurred to me some other things that I hadn't really taken into consideration. Barriers and obstacles. It occurred because yesterday was the feast of St. Peter and Paul, and I thought, when am I going to get to Mass? You know, actually, I got to Mass fine, but I remember once, years and years ago, when I was working as an accountant on an industrial estate, I had to leave really early in the morning. Didn't go off this industrial estate till about 6 at night, and it was really difficult to find a Mass. So it was a question of time and place. And it often occurs to me when, you know, people say, well, you can drive to the next parish. Well, some people don't drive. I don't drive. The roads are safer because I don't drive, because I can't tell left from right. And I had this propensity to want to drive on the right-hand side of the road. And I thought maybe that was my continental side coming out. But I was amazed when I did the ancestry DNA thing that I'm 39% Irish, 56% Scottish, 3% Iberian and 1% Russian, so not too much continental stuff there. Maybe I'm just awkward or clumsy. So time and place. Language and understanding. I was talking to a couple of Australians recently, and they said that one of the problems that they have in some of their parishes is that priests coming in from other countries are very difficult to understand. Really, impossible. I thought, well, that's interesting. So, just throw it out there. Shortage of priests. Well, that's self-evident in some countries, Africa, South America, and so on. Self-exclusion, I'll come on and talk to. Exclusion by the law, I will talk also to. But maybe you want to just take a minute to think for yourselves about what do you consider to be the barriers and obstacles to Eucharist. So just take a minute just to think about that. So let's just hold them there, and we'll bring them up when we move into the discussion phase. I want to talk about the things that have struck me recently, and one of those is about self-exclusion. The Code of Canon Law is a handy wee book, by the way, don't be turned off by the title. Code of Canon Law, fabulous. Although in the wrong hands, like the Bible, it can be a weapon of mass destruction. So you really need to be able to interpret it. But in the paragraph, in Canon 916 of the Code says that anyone who is conscious of grave sin may not celebrate Mass or receive the body of the Lord without previously having been to sacramental confession, unless there is grave reason and there is no opportunity to confess. In this case, the person is to remember the obligation to make an act of perfect contrition, which includes the resolve to go to confession as soon as possible. There we have it. So, no problem there. Or is there? My mother, God rest her, was of a generation who did not go to communion often. We always had to go to confession beforehand and never received communion in the hand. That was her choice, and I respected that. However, it didn't stop me from asking her the question, so who have you murdered this week that you can't go to communion? And it was a serious question, because if anyone should have gone to communion, it was her. And it caused me to reflect on why some people exclude themselves when they don't have to. And I've identified two possibilities: scrupulosity and toxic guilt. Scrupulosity. Now, this might be defined as an obsessive concern for sin, or seeing sin in everything. And a number of saints suffered from the condition at one time or another, St. Ignatius of Loyola being one of them. And now it's a subset of a condition known as OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And the sufferer believes that they have sinned, well, even though they haven't, and might go to confession very often, more than twice a week, possibly. The condition itself is, in its serious stages, needs medical intervention, so repeated confessions won't help. And it's estimated that 1 in 50 people suffer from this condition. I remember that a colleague who specialised in looking at this particular issue said that there's an annual convention of people with obsessive compulsive disorder. That kind of really thought, I wonder what that is like, you know. In fact, people, 500 people go around checking the plugs are off or whatever. So there's usually about 500 people attending. And he says he put on a workshop on the subject of scrupulosity. And he had 300 people turn up to it. So we might think it's a kind of hidden disorder, but it's something that I think we need to be aware of. Guilt. I often think that West of Scotland Catholics cornered the market in guilt, although I'm not so sure about that. Guilt itself can be useful. There is a guilt that's like a gentle nudge, or maybe for some of us a sharp stab of the elbow, which reminds us that we ought not to do something, or indeed that we ought to be doing something. Or even that what I am becoming is not the kind of person that God's love calls me to. And that kind of guilt is a useful reminder. Wilfred McGreal says, an absence of guilt in a person's life would be a pathological condition. If I have agreed to give time to a sick person and then cannot be bothered because of laziness, I have clearly behaved in a selfish way. If I begin to feel bad about the situation, I am challenged to do something positive. And if I do apologise and make up, then my guilt has brought help and healed the situation. Healthy guilt, as in this case, is a call to responsibility and enables us to grow. And yet there's something called toxic guilt. And I think there's quite a lot of it that floats about. Lionel Shriver describes it in this way. You sleep through your alarm, you feel guilty. You snap at your kids at breakfast, you feel guilty. You go on Facebook at work, you feel guilty. You order chips at lunch, you feel guess. What has all this guilt accomplished? It has destroyed all the pleasure in your life like a flesh-eating virus. This useless, despoiling guilt, she says, a guilt that doesn't change what you do, is an acid emotion. And is often associated with low self-esteem or high levels of responsibility. And this excessive guilt causes a person to look for reasons to dislike or even hate themselves. Such internalised feelings of inadequacy can come from an overly critical parent, sibling, teacher or friend, or even from a false image of God. God could never love me. I don't often remember what I hear in homilies, to be perfectly honest, but I heard a homily in Cambridge which really made me sit up, and I was so shocked that I had to write to the priest afterwards and say, did you really say what I think you said? Because it was amazing. It says, the devil's greatest triumph is to have us believe that God will never forgive us. I thought, wow, that's amazing. And, you know, I talked about toxic guilt once in a cathedral, and I was amazed at how many people came up to me afterwards and said thanks, because we've never heard that before, and obviously had resonated with them. So, I'm just going to stop for a minute there and suggest that you just have a little buzz in your groups. See what you think so far. Rubbish. And I'll just, you can maybe share a few aspects before I go on to the question of excluded by law, which is quite a difficult issue. So just take a few minutes in your groups just to see what you come up with. At this stage, are there any pearls of wisdom or points that you'd like to share with the wider group that you absolutely bust into bring forward? What do you mean, no? Like them, clergy. All right. Anything? No? Yes?
I was interested that Canon Law excludes people from attending Mass who are conscious of grave sin.
Well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't exclude them. What it means is, if it's a priest, he can't celebrate Mass.
Right.
Yeah, can't celebrate. But if it's supposedly he's in a mission station, right, and he's been up to something naughty, right, and he can't get to confession, well, he makes a good act of contrition. It says Mass and then has to go to confession at some stage, you know.
I suppose my mistake was I thought we were all celebrating Mass.
Good point. Good point. Yeah.
That's where my confusion is.
Yeah. No, good point. And that's good clarification. Thanks. Actually, when I first read it, that's what I thought as well, and I thought, oh, okay. Yeah. Anything else?
What law are you talking about?
The
law of the Church?
Yes, the Code of Canon Law, 1983. Yeah. Every house should have one. You can get one for a tenner, they're not expensive. And it's actually quite interesting because you'll find that from Canons 208 onwards, there's a list of rights of the faithful which are listed there, as well as obligations. So you might want to have a wee look at that, give your parish priest a fright. So bad. Alright, so let's move on then. Canon 912 says that any baptised person who's not forbidden by law may and must be admitted to Holy Communion. And of course notice baptism there. Baptism is the gateway to the sacraments. Mm-hmm.
Lots of people are baptised in different denominations.
Yes, it's implying that it's baptised in the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah. It's baptised in the Roman Catholic Church. So the first of these difficulties arises in terms of reception of the Eucharist, is where a Christian marriage exists, but one spouse is a Catholic and the other is a member of another Christian church which is not in full communion with the Catholic Church. And we know that since the church came into being there have been major divisions. The first one being with the Orthodox churches in 1054, and then we have the Reformations in the 16th century. And when all Christians share many beliefs, in Jesus Christ, in baptism, the Bible is the Word of God, major differences in beliefs still do exist, including the question of the primacy of the Pope, the sacrificial priesthood, and the nature of sacraments, including what the Eucharist is. Protestant theology differs with Catholic theology in regard to the Eucharist over the real presence of Christ and transubstantiation. Now, a lot of progress has been made since the Second Vatican Council to discuss these differences with various Christian groups. But such differences are held by the Catholic Church still to break the common participation in the table of the Lord. That's in the Catechism, paragraph 1398. However, there are rays of hope. We shouldn't be totally despairing. The 1983 Code of Canon Law makes provision and an exception for emergency cases. In terms of members of the Orthodox churches, who primarily disagree with Catholics over the authority of the Pope, the Second Vatican Council's decree on ecumenism, 1964, noted that though they are separated from the Catholic Church, they possess true sacraments, above all by apostolic succession, the priesthood and the Eucharist. So, this being the case, the Code of Canon Law stipulates that the sacraments of reconciliation, Eucharist and the anointing of the sick may be administered to members of the Orthodox churches if they ask on their own initiative for these sacraments and are properly disposed. There is also another provision in Canon 844 for other Christians receiving these sacraments as well, if they are in danger of death. Danger of death, the gloves are off. We remember that, well, you won't know, or it's interesting though, the last code in the Code of Canon Law says that the supreme law of the Church is the salvation of souls. And you know, all through the code, in danger of death, you know, there's canonical wiggle room, as it were. There's also hopeful dialogue. Now, we've heard a lot about Christian dialogue that's been going on. I think one of the hopeful ones, the more recent ones, was this quotation. It was a joint declaration signed by Pope Francis and the Lutheran Bishop Muni Yunan, President of the Lutheran World Federation in 2016. And that this acknowledged that many members of our communities yearn to receive the Eucharist at one table as a concrete expression of full unity. We experience the pain of those who share their whole lives but cannot share God's redeeming presence at the Eucharistic table. We acknowledge our joint pastoral responsibility to respond to the spiritual thirst and hunger of our people to be one in Christ. We long for this wound in the body of Christ to be healed. This is the goal of our ecumenical endeavours, which we wish to advance, also by renewing our commitment to theological dialogue. And following this, and in discussing this document, Cardinal Kurt Koch noted an important distinction. While the term Eucharistic communion refers to a more regular situation of the reception of communion by people recognised as belonging to the same family, and is problematic for the reasons already discussed, Eucharistic hospitality, on the other hand, is used to refer to welcoming guests to the Eucharist on special occasions or under special circumstances, as long as they recognise the real presence of Christ. This is clearly a ray of hope, and one which could generate more light as the dialogue continues. However, it has to be said there are some elements in the Church, especially in the blogosphere, who are not happy with these developments and think it's a watering down of the faith. So not everybody thinks the same thing. Another aspect is that of marriage breakdown, and I think this is one of the single most pressing pastoral problems that we face today. Although entered into with the best of intentions and hope for the future, it's a reality that marriages fail and that couples separate and divorce. Often a divorced spouse may decide to remain single, or seek a declaration of nullity of the first marriage, sometimes referred to as an annulment, so that they can get married again in the Church. Sometimes, though, it's the case that for various reasons, such a declaration is not obtained. Since they are still bound by the bonds of the previous marriage, even though divorced in the eyes of the state, they might enter into a second non-canonical marriage. Now, I've heard a lot of nonsense talked about. People who are separated cannot receive communion. Not true. People who are divorced cannot receive communion. Not true. People who divorce and stay single, of course they can receive communion. If they get a declaration of nullity, they can remarry in the Catholic Church. The problem comes when there's no declaration and they marry civilly. So it's important that there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. So as I said, there's no problem with someone who's either separated or divorced from approaching the Eucharist, but they might want to reflect on to what degree they may have contributed to the marriage breakdown. Now, the language used in the Code of Canon Law to describe people in such a situation of irregular marriage has been significantly toned down from the previous code of 1917. There it pulled no punches and referred to people in irregular second marriages as bigamists. And it threatened excommunication on those who didn't resolve their unlawful situation. Such people were excluded from the Eucharist until they had shown signs of repentance, amendment of life, and had publicly repaired the scandal caused by their actions. The revised code no longer uses such language, and it's interesting that the divorced and remarried are not specifically identified. Though Canon 915 says that those who obstinately persevere in manifest grave sin are not to be admitted to the Eucharist. Now, it doesn't say anything about people there in second civil marriages, but if you look at the Catechism, it says contracting a new union, even if recognised in civil law, puts the remarried spouse in a situation of public and permanent adultery. Now, this continues to be a pressing pastoral problem, because various synods of bishops have raised this question of exclusion from the Eucharist at a number of different gatherings, particularly the 1980 Synod of Bishops on the family. And Pope John Paul in Familiaris Consortio noted a distinction between those who tried to save their first marriage but were unjustly abandoned, and those who destroyed a canonically valid marriage. And he recognises that there are those who entered into a second union for the sake of their children, and those who are subjectively certain in conscience that their previous and irreparably destroyed marriage had never been valid. Now, he reiterates that the people who are divorced and remarried are unable to be admitted to the Eucharist, but at the same time, he calls to pastors to make a careful discernment of different situations. So he's suggesting that not all cases are the same. Now, Pope Francis takes up these ideas in Amoris Laetitia, when he speaks of the need to integrate people living in irregular situations. He said such persons need to feel not as excommunicated members of the Church, because they're not excommunicated in the technical sense, but instead as living members, able to live and grow in the Church, and experience her as a mother who welcomes them always, who takes care of them with affection, and encourages them along the path of life and the gospel. And of course, there is another issue there for people who are coming into the church if they're in an irregular marriage situation. And pastors have really wrestled with this problem. It's interesting that Pope Francis comes in for a lot of criticism from some people on the blogospheres, he's softening down the church's teaching and so on, but in fact he's reiterating what has been part of the church's tradition. In the 1940s in America, it was the case that a large number of African Americans were joining the church, and it was found that some of them were in second marriages, right? So what do? Do they try to get things put right? Or do they look at people's desire to join the church? And what they did was, they're called a good faith situation. They just accepted the marriage as it was, and they joined the church. So what Francis is saying in Amoris Laetitia is not new. Although people think it is new, it's not new. But he's putting out there what those in the know have always known, as it were. So the Pope's call for mercy to be attentive to people's distress in difficult and complex situations, and the need to avoid judgments which fail to take account of these, can be considered to be another ray of hope to those who, for whatever reason, are excluded from the Eucharist. So I mentioned some barriers and obstacles that may be internal, as generated by ourselves, or external by way of prohibition of the law. So I've come up with some questions for reflection. How do we educate people in a proper notion of guilt and sin? What images of God do we need to get away from? How do we help people sort out irregular marriage situations where this is possible? How do we overcome other barriers identified? And how do we help those who feel marginalised or excluded? Now, you're all in table groups, most of you, or organise yourself if you're not. And I would like to give you maybe 20 minutes to look at each of those questions, and then I'll ask each table to report back on any thoughts that you've had, so we can pool our collective wisdom. Not collective ignorance, but collective wisdom. Okay? Gives you a rest from listening to me. Alright, so I'm going to come around the tables and ask you to maybe say something about what we discussed. If you have a spokesperson or whoever wants to grab the microphone. Alright, who will I start with first? I'll aim for this corner here.
Good morning, everyone. We didn't get too far down the history because there's so much to talk about. But taking the question as a springboard, we carried on. And the education of people goes into several groups. We've got primary school age, secondary school age, formative years after that, and adulthood. And we're all in place of guilt and sin we feel that came from actually the love of God and not dwelling on the negative aspects of guilt and sin, which are, of course, negative, but we need to know that God loves us and we move forward that way. And how we help people sort out, even among ourselves, we found that we had different impressions of the various marriage situations, and really teaching people or encouraging people to speak with others who do know and not feel that things are inaccessible to them, and there are solutions, and support and love again. encourages people to move forward in their formation. We felt that formation itself is a huge problem amongst us Catholics in the Church. It's not necessarily done at school age because not all Catholic children attend Catholic schools. Then where is it done? It seems to be done in blocks of parents with children to be baptised. Well, the blocks are the sacraments, communion and confirmation, and we prefer to see, I think, an ongoing formation, and also it's really quite difficult to know where to find some of the answers about annulment, nullity, about marriage situations, and encouraging people. It's about where we're going, not where we've been to, and the guilt is where we've been, not where we're going.
I should just remind you there's water at the back there in case anybody wants it. Unfortunately, I can't change it into wine. I remember by primary school we were taught, one of the lessons we were taught was the difference between mortal and venial sin. And I remember the teacher saying, "Oh, mortal sin, it leaves a stain on your soul which can never be rubbed out." I'm traumatised still. Who from this group?
Yes, we focused on the two aspects to it. The images of God. With that, we were thinking about our sons and daughters who no longer come regularly to Mass. And that, interestingly enough, what came out was that it was felt they had a sort of God will understand sort of idea, where they would quite happily attend Mass without necessarily going to confession first. We felt that part of this was having an informed conscience, whether they're in fact ensuring they have an informed conscience. Often they might attend the main festivals, the main Masses, Easter, etc., but not really attend throughout the year. I must admit, something that occurred to me is that I'm very concerned about the term lapsed. We too quickly, I think, put the label lapsed on people, when in fact we really don't know their inward feelings and their relationship with the Lord. And so therefore I have found it certainly personally better to accept the situation as far as the particular person is concerned. And it's quite amazing, we can find that we possibly made a mistake or two in making assumptions of what they're not doing as opposed to what they are doing. The other thing we touched on was how we help the marginalised. The first thing, of course, we need to do is to identify who they are. It's very important in church to have a welcome and a getting to know of people. I think one of the problems can be is that we think that we can do that on a one-off. You know, we see somebody we think is marginalised and go up and we sort of chat to them, introduce ourselves to them. And that's it. We don't see them again necessarily, or we don't go up to them again. So there is a point, I think, at which we need to develop some sort of relationship. It doesn't have to be, you know, an every week thing necessarily, but to recognise people and remember the names and that sort of thing is very important. And of course, care and prayer for such people is paramount importance.
Okay.
Thank you, Helen. Just to follow on from the last table, if we could start with the last point, and we very much agree with you in terms of welcoming So, but we didn't really know who might be feeling marginalised in the first place. So to go up and be open and welcoming is probably quite important. But that reminded me of a story of a parishioner who, in another meeting like this, said they were welcomed the first time they went into a parish by the welcomer. They took their position in the pew, and then the same welcomer came to them in the pew and said, "This is my seat." So welcoming is definitely very important. To go to the first point, how to educate people in proper notion of guilt and sin. So what is sin? We're trying to identify what set of rules we follow, and the rules could be church rules, or they could even be civil rules or government rules. But it's a set of rules that we decide to follow. So what rules we follow, and it's probably down to our own conscience to a great extent, but it's a difficult question. The guilt is going against the rules that you follow. So that's probably a proper notion, and a proper notion I think Helen, you cover those in the proper notions quite well. What image of God do we need to get away from? The artistic notion of a cloudy man in the sky, fearful, non-forgiving. How do we help people to sort out irregular marriage situations? And the first part of that conversation really was about, once the marriage is broken up, how is it best to make the best of that situation? And the troublesome part of the sentence was irregular marriage situations, which kind of implies that you're in the marriage already. So how do you identify those marriage situations which are irregular when you're in the marriage, and then at that point you do something about it? That's kind of quite important. And how do we help that? The priests, and even the married clergy, if I can mention it like that, deacons, for example, who have an experience of marriage, for example. Yeah. How do we overcome the other barriers identified? There are so many barriers. We try to go through the ones that we identified, but I think we've already talked about welcoming. We've already talked about scriptures, the signposts or the signs in the church. But one very important overcoming of the barrier was prayer. So, did I miss anything?
No. I have an experience in the US when I've been in a parish. At the end of Mass, the priest says, "Is there anybody new here?" And you have to stand up. It's kind of embarrassing, to be honest. But he goes around and asks, where are you from? People say all over the States, and I say, London, England, by way of Scotland. And they always say, "Oh, the motherland." But it's a nice way of doing it, to acknowledge that there are new people here. Okay, who's the victim?
Hello everybody. I'm very lucky because I've got some very clever people here, so I've got some good answers. Anyway, we went from the top down. Basically. How do we educate people about guilt and sin? What we're looking at here really is an increase in faith in the love of God. One of the things that was suggested was Scripture. Looking at Scripture, because Scripture can answer questions. And there is encouraging people and exposing people to catechism. And then we got on about talking about guilt and sin, the words guilt and sin. And we wanted to think not so much of guilt, but as contrition instead. Because guilt is passive, it's, "Oh, look at me, I'm so bad." Whereas contrition it's an active thing, isn't it? It's, I've done something wrong and I want to put it right. So rather than talking about guilt, we should perhaps be talking about contrition instead. It's a positive concept rather than a passive lump. Moving on to the next question. I didn't read it properly. What images of God do we need to get away from? And I'm giving all the things that is the exact opposite. So stupid me. But fortunately, with these clever people. Yes, I forget which table it was. I think it might have been you. we are given to believe in the man in the sky, and that he's vindictive, he's remote, he's angry, he's a judge, and he lives in the sky. And we came up with fear and distance. Any image that causes these feelings is the wrong image, because, as we know, God, in his infinite wisdom, bless him, and his huge and almighty power, chooses to come and live among us as a human man. But that doesn't answer the question. That's what I was saying, but it doesn't answer the question. It's the exact opposite. God is a God of love who lives amongst us, his children, as our loving Father, and that is the relationship that we need to pass on to people. How do we sort out irregular marriage situations? Interesting that you had assumed that the marriage had broken down, and therefore the people were single, separated, whatever. Because our main feeling was that we have new people coming in some kind of an irregular marriage, and how do we deal with that? Well, of course, the first thing is to welcome them with open arms, but we all know that. We could advise them to seek a Christian marriage counselling situation, which obviously is available, and that could be one possible way. And are they actually in an irregular marriage? Do they know what an irregular marriage is? Is it irregular, or is it regular? Or do they think it's okay, and actually it isn't? And there's always, of course, this discrepancy over civil and canon law. Because, yeah, we're married. We're married in the registry office. No. And, of course, referring to the scriptures again will give us help and understanding in our ideas about marriage. Our Lord Jesus talks quite a lot about marriage in the New Testament, obviously, but you know that. How do we overcome the barriers identified? We didn't really understand this question, so we looked at the next one, which is how do we help those who feel marginalised or excluded? And then we looked at the two questions and realised that actually they're kind of linked. In fact, they're probably the same. So how would we help those who feel marginalised or excluded? Well, we would try to give a loving welcome and acceptance of the person, whoever they are, whatever the barriers. We would encourage their participation. Come and have a cup of tea. I'm going for a cup of tea. Come and have a cup of tea. We talked about diversity, and we felt it was a two-way thing. We have to be loving and accepting and everything else, but equally the other person needs to do that as well. And to get away from this, I don't know, is it a middle-class white image that people seem to have about people who go to church? Because it's not true anymore, is it? We know that, just as we know that God is not an angry man in the sky. But again, we are trying to break down this barrier of how people sometimes see us. And of course, there are always psychological barriers that we felt. One of the things that Father was telling us was that it was known to somebody that he speaks Italian. And it was felt that to have an Italian mass might be quite a good idea. And that happened. And it was very successful, and lots of people came. So that's kind of an acknowledgement of someone's identity in a very active and practical way. So another word we came across was integration. I told them I'd use all the big words because then I would sound clever. Integration, we need to invite them into whatever it is we're doing. And there's been a questionnaire, and a Bible study has been suggested. Well, you know, some people that weren't really expected to join this have joined in because it's an invitation. We need to be inviting. We need to just help them to join in. And of course that all goes back to that dreaded word, doesn't it, which I'm going to use, which is evangelisation. And I can feel you all recoil in horror. And of course evangelisation isn't something to recoil in horror. It's just about offering people an invitation. That's all it is. And we can all do that, can't we? I'm talking too much. I'll give her back the microphone.
Very good. Thank you. When I think of evangelisation, I tend to think of, this manic street preachers who are shouting, "You're all doomed." Sometimes it doesn't get a good press. Okay, this table.
Thank you. We had a long discussion. We had a long discussion at the beginning that was not related to any specific one of the questions, which is very hard for us who wasn't me to address, to note down. So we only really came to the questions towards the end. But I'll give you the others that we came up with. How do we educate people in a proper notion of guilt and sin? We talked about reassurance and explanation. We talked about the need for people, this was with reference to people perhaps in irregular situations. We talked about people being open about their situation, and for us to be open about the Church's position, including the Pope's, I'm tempted to use the word softening of that, or a more subtle approach. That we needed to be, we needed to pass on an education in what the Church's law consists of. I mean, people are surprised sometimes that the list of separated, divorced and single, annulled and divorced and being married again. People are surprised at which point the irregularity came in. And we need to know that, particularly if we're in a position of passing on information, but also in our attitudes to people who are in those various situations. It was said a few times, what's bound on earth is bound in heaven, what's loosed on earth is loosed in heaven. That instruction to Peter, as Jesus left the earth. Images of God, I've got two expressions here. One is judgmental God, and the other is fearful God. Two things that we really need, actually. Maybe not fearful God, a God who inspires fear, rather than who experiences it. So we're moving away, the Church has moved away. In my lifetime, to some extent, from the God who sees and writes down every misdemeanour, and it's there in the book for when I die, to the God who sees kindly, and the God who inspires love and affection and not fear. I mean, fear of the Lord is an expression that we're re-understanding in our time. And with regard to people in regular situations, and all the last three really, we haven't got a whole lot written down here. But one of the comments that came up was, we respond with care and prayer, which has been said, but also we seek help ourselves to be in a position to help other people, to be in a position to understand other people in their situations.
Pass the exam.
I'll turn it off.
Yeah. Pass the exam. Right, who's at this table? Okay.
A lot of things have already been covered, but I will go through what we came up with in our discussions, and it was an excellent discussion. We really all had input into it. The themes that underlay our discussions was that we have a loving God, and we want a caring environment. We want an open environment to actually communicate effectively this
these themes. So we started off looking about the education of people, where what we focused on was actually the opportunities for the education, because a lot of people don't realise they need any teaching. We focused on where could this education be provided. We looked at the possibility of our priests talking to some extent at some point in the pulpit. Huh? Sorry. Yeah. We talked about our priests talking from the pulpit. We talked about actually getting people together in community functions so people have time for talking. We talked about people giving their testimonies as so very important, because that is an excellent way of communicating from the heart. We talked about talking to people individually and continuing support of that. We need to be open and have plenty of opportunities for this to occur. The images of God, what we looked at was some of the things, as people have already said, that we want, the things we want to get rid of is the fear that God is vengeful and angry, and that, you creates this feeling that you are just of guilt. But it just promotes guilt. But as we have already talked about, guilt is still important in realising that there are some things that you've done wrong, but the guilt which is not needed, so people can come to the church and feel valued and cared for. We talked about irregular marriage. Where irregular marriage was concerned, we had to have an environment again of openness and hospitality, and communication was very, very important, and also personal support. And again, testimony can come into this as well. But it's also providing a link and confidence for them to go to the priest to talk about it. We talked about overcoming barriers. One thing that was mentioned in the talk was about language, where some priests may have second language. We, as the parishioners, need to support our priests in every way we can, because they have given their whole lives to God, and we need to be there, although our lives might be busy in other ways, but we need to be there for them. We looked at self-exclusion and the difficulties there, and it is again individual support and making people welcome. And of course a non-judgmental atmosphere. We talked about how do we help those who feel marginalised and excluded, and of course the themes come through here is communication, education, welcome, and an ongoing support, so there's opportunities for people to come back to talk about things again. Good, thank you. Is there anything you wanted to add?
No.
I like the point you made about caring for priests, because I think some priests get from parishioners have a really tough time, and I just think, what is that about? Okay, this table.
Thank you. Again, a lot of the stuff's already been covered, but how do we educate people in a combination of guilt and sin? Partly, I think a lot of people's education stopped at primary school, so they've still got very black and white thing. So generally, we do need parish formation. Again, we have the problem: how do we get the right people to come along? for instance, how many parishes are we from here and how many people have actually turned up. So a lot of time we're preaching to the converted. And also it was pointed out that if you do come along to one of these parish formations and maybe you feel you are in a regular situation, how many people there are going to be on the moral high horse and, well, you shouldn't be here, should you? So it's the ones who need help and the ones who need to recognise they perhaps need help. The images of God we were talking about, we need to get away from the image of the vengeful God of the Old Testament, but we need to avoid the image of wishy-washy Jesus meek and mild. He is judgmental, but it's fair and loving and merciful judgment. How do we help sort out irregular marriage situations? This is a bit tricky, but the main thing is, as has already been said, acceptance, and to know that there's somewhere we can go to accept them, and we try and find out how we can help. And as Sister pointed out, if you do feel that you can't receive communion, there is spiritual communion, so people can still attend Mass, they can gain the liturgy of the Word, they can be there for Mass. Other barriers, again, parish formation with the usual provisos. If there is a language barrier, in some parishes we have a priest who perhaps isn't always 100% difficult, easy to understand. Maybe something like his sermon could be bullet pointed in the newsletter or available on the website, or so that we can still get those gems of wisdom that all the clergy deliver every week. And how we help those who feel marginalised or excluded. Things like social events, like some parishes have social events that are open to the community, it's not just for the parish, or for regular attenders. By our witness, and as also been said, we are the Eucharist. By our actions, we should be recognised. Anything else?
I sometimes think the God of the Old Testament has a PR problem. He was actually quite a nice guy. Okay, from this too.
We generally discuss and share about the various things, but we didn't go down all the questions, and so, but we've heard all what you said, so I would just add the points that we particularly share in this group. So the first one is actually pastoral care, not just the priest focusing on pastoral care, just the importance of pastoral care, but also the parish itself that share that need of pastoral care, so that we can actually, so that all the parishioners can actually don't look at people judgmentally, and actually sort of care for them and support them in whether it is actually irregular marriage situations or other situations. So that's just a parish focused thing. The other thing that we floated about is actually whether listening to a lot of people about the difficulties to go to priests about irregular marriages, whether there will be any wisdom of having a helpline as such, a telephone line, that people can actually just ring in, and with their circumstances, and then seek sort of expert initial advice on that people don't need to give a lot of their details about it, but that will give them assurance. On a diocese level, or you may be even not funded on a bishop's conference level. As the need arises, so we just floated that idea, and and we think that could be useful to a lot of people in difficult circumstances, that they can seek help without all the emotion turmoil of getting there.
That's a very good suggestion. I like that. Very good. And last, but by no means least.
Hi, I didn't dodge quickly enough, unfortunately. On the question of guilt, we noticed this is some sort of anecdotes about some of the people we know in various movements who are very highly motivated, very energetic, very committed, but along with that can come also a tendency to guilt and scrupulosity. And perhaps that's, in a way, two sides of the same coin, that what is an advantage in some respects, has a sort of negative side. And that's true of a lot of things, really. The image of God, tendency to look for a God, to see God as someone who's looking for our obedience, but obedience in the sense of conformity, conforming to a set of rules, and very often our rules are a lot narrower than God's rules. It reminded me of people I knew when I was teaching in the seminary, students I knew who I used to say they want to be more orthodox than the church. They've got a very narrow idea of what orthodoxy is. And the difficulty there is that sometimes you can have good principles, like, for example, how to pray, how to behave in church, which are good as far as they go, but they can get too rigid and sort of get taken to an extreme, so that the idea is that you only pray in one way, or, for example, in the offertory procession you can't have anything other than bread, wine and money. Anything else is sort of unorthodox somehow. In some ways, it's ridiculous, really. Some of that can come across not only in what people say, but also in our body language. So sometimes the priest can come across, as a sort of very rigid and scrupulous, not only what he says, but just by how he behaves on the altar. And not only the priest. Sometimes the way that people in the congregation can behave. Say, for example, if there's a little child running around, and the way people sort of look very stern and cross and so on. Personally, when I'm celebrating Mass and that happens, I sort of generally try to defuse that by just sort of making some sort of welcoming comment, On the irregular marriage question, we didn't really address that, but there was something came out indirectly. We said a little bit about Pope Francis, how he's been encouraging a sort of more mature and responsible approach to moral questions, and that can make people feel uncomfortable because, in a way, operating on rules is much easier, and yet there's always a need for educating our conscience. There's something we didn't say, but just an idea that came to my mind on that subject I'd like to share with you, is a story about Canon Law, a famous priest who died a few years ago. Did come across as rather stern sometimes and strict, but there's a story I heard about him where a parishioner came to him and said, there's this couple that we know who are divorced and remarried, and they come to Holy Communion each Sunday. What do you think about that? And Ivan is supposed to have said to her, well, I suggest you go and talk to them and see why what they say, and why they do that. And so it went away, and because the person who'd asked Devan was herself, from a divorced and remarried situation. And anyway, she went away, and the next Sunday, she and her husband came up to communion, and without saying anything, and Devan didn't ask any questions. So it's sort of, it's not really up to the priest to be probing and prying into people's, into their lives. What else do we have? Welcoming. We talked a lot about welcoming and how do we encourage a culture of welcoming in the parish. And we need to make a very deliberate effort for that because we're so much geared up to going to Mass, getting away as soon as possible to get on with our lives, and that we need to make space for things like socialising after Mass. Some parishes have a parish breakfast. then you've got to make an effort to make sure that anyone who goes along for the first time is made to feel welcome, and so it's sort of something we have to keep on working at. I've probably left out an awful lot, but I don't know if anyone wants to add anything.
Thanks very much. Have I done all the tables? Yeah, is there anybody else bursting to say anything? We've covered an awful lot of ground. It's probably done your head in. We've looked at various barriers, possibly ways we can overcome them. So I think there's quite a bit there for you to take away from today. Are there any final questions or points that you would like to raise? I don't know who's playing in the World Cup this afternoon, but I'm sure you'll be in the pub watching it. Anything?
Can I just make a comment?
Yes.
It seems to me that when we look at marital situations from the outside, we tend to see them in structural terms. You know, this has happened, that's happened. What we don't see is the complexity of human emotions,
Yeah.
which are going through people's heads.
Yes, very good point. We don't see the complexity of emotions, and I think Pope Francis in Amoris Laetitia actually talks about that, the messiness of life, and you know he really gets into it. And in fact, he talks about the dysfunctionality in families at the start. You know, some families put the fun into dysfunctional. And he and he acknowledges that, which is fantastic, because not everybody, you know, starts from that perspective. You know, most families are dysfunctional to some degree or another. So I think recognising, you know, where we are before we can get somewhere else. Anything else? Okay. Yeah, go on.
There's one thing perhaps might be worth just mentioning is I've had a fair bit to do with the what's it called now, the Association of Interchurch Families.
Oh, yes.
And obviously that's not to do with irregular situations, it's to do with couples from different churches. And one of the things that comes across very strongly from them, they're really involved in a sort of ongoing dialogue and reflection, in a sense, with the rest of the church on the whole thing about, it's not just that they're campaigning for, you know, intercommunion today, so to speak, but one very profound idea is to begin with the fact that, you know, in marriage the two become one, and someone from one church marries someone from another church, they're both baptized, you know, they become one body. And yet, you know, they're two different churches, and there's a sort of tension there. And so I suppose over the 30 years or so that they've been going, 30 or 40 years maybe, there's been an awful lot of creative, no instant sort of solutions or anything, but an awful lot of creative reflection on that whole question about, you know, sort of how do we resolve that? How do we, in terms of bringing up the children, how do we help the children to see the strength and the beauty in each of the two traditions and all of that? I just sort of wanted to flag that up as there's a lot going on there, and I think that's something to celebrate.
Thank you very much.
It's just occurred to me while we're talking that we've come here really to talk about the Eucharist, and we've gathered because we are people, and mostly with a view to the Eucharistic Congress, and we've spent most of the morning talking about marriage. And it just makes me think that perhaps the Church has got into using the Eucharist as a kind of stick to coerce people to sort out their marriage situation. I mean, we could talk about, did we deprive people of the Eucharist as a punishment for their sinful situation? And we didn't resolve that, we didn't answer that question, but it just makes me wonder if the Eucharist is being used in that way for people, you know, regularise your marriage situation and will let you receive the Eucharist. I know that's not how the Church would put it. Anyway, it's just occurred to me.
I think the question behind that is, who owns the barrier?
No, it's a very good question. Yeah. Is there anybody else?
One area that was mentioned very early on was the shortage of priests and the fact that there aren't seemingly enough priests to celebrate the Eucharist. And perhaps we need the answer maybe to pray for priests, but we've been doing that for 50 years. And we believe that prayers are answered, so what's happening? So maybe we need some other way of looking at the priesthood. So perhaps we need to think about ordaining who we can't ordain at the moment. Pope Francis, I know, is looking at the moment I believe in Latin America, at ordaining men who are respected in their communities and of a good life, without going through years and years of seminary preparation. Much shorter course, and who are married. And before you say, oh, we can't have married priests, Southwark does have married priests working in the diocese. I won't talk about lady priests.
I was surprised I was surprised that we didn't emphasize the aspects of our faith in the Eucharist. How do those of us who receive the Eucharist, do we really see God, see Jesus in the Eucharist? Perhaps how we behave after receiving the Eucharist makes our children not to bother about receiving the Eucharist. If we truly believe that it's Jesus we receive, possibly, or it should also show in our behavior. And I guess the way we behave have caused our children to turn their back to the Eucharist.
Oh, you're kicking at an open door here, because I'm sometimes appalled actually by the behaviour of some grown-ups in church. You know, they never stop talking before Mass and even during communion. But I had a horror story, I'll share it with you. I was at Mass once and I saw this, I go to Mass all the time, but I was at Mass, tip Mass, and I saw this young girl, supposed to be about 7 or 8, so she'd made her first communion. She brings the host back to her pew, right? And then starts dive bombing her sister with it. And I was just about to say something when she consumed it. I thought, right, but I'll be keeping an eye on you, lady. Well, blow me, 2 weeks later, she and her mother are beside, not the sister, but the mother are beside me. She brings the host again back to the pew, footers about with it, and consumes it. And I thought, oh, no. I said to the mother at the end, I said, do you realise your daughter's been doing this? And she looked at me and says, why, is there a problem? I thought maybe I've lived too long, you know, but to hear that, I just thought, what's that about? So yes, I think there is an issue about how we behave, as it were, and what is it we think we're doing. You know, you're not, texting on your mobile phone, you're not to receive the Lord. I've seen that, chewing gum, yapping away, well, whatever. But anyway, all is not lost, but there's a lot of work to be done. So I think we've covered an enormous amount of ground, and I'm ready for a cup of tea. Don't know about you. Anyway, I hope it's been helpful. But thank you all very much for your contributions and for listening to one another.
Thank you.